Welcome to Plus One Forward, the podcast powered by the Apocalypse, where we talk about tabletop role-playing games using or inspired by the Apocalypse engine. I'm your MC, Rach, and I'm joined today by my guests, Daniel Kwan and Patrick Kean of Dundas West Games. Welcome to the show, guys.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us on. Super excited.
Yeah, this is cool. Get to talk about games.
Right? So let's talk a little bit about your background in games before we dig into Ross rifles.
Academically, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. I'm an archaeologist. Actually, Patrick, you're also an archaeologist.
Yep, not quite at the same level. I'm still in my undergraduate, but I am studying archaeology.
Yeah, so. And I'm a teacher at the Royal Ontario Museum. I've been teaching there since 2011. I run the very popular Dungeons & Dragons program there, where we play tabletop role-playing games, not just D&D, to kind of teach history, science, and social skills. I'm also one of the co-founders of Level Up Gaming. It's a Toronto-based organization that provides adults with autism and other disabilities sort of guided group experiences using tabletop games to help develop their social skills. I also host a podcast called Curiosity in Focus, but it's not just gaming.
Yeah, and I have this sort of a similar background in gaming as Daniel does. I was a participant in the Dungeons & Dragons program for a long time when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And I've now become the second in command there.
Yeah, you're the second in command.
So I do play D&D and other games for a living, and it's really living the dream in my opinion.
Yeah, and we run Dundas West Games together. We have a consulting business through it where we do like GMs for hire. Mm-hmm. We have a couple clients right now. We have a private school and a family in the area.
Read a Sitch.
So let's go back, and the focus of the Read a Sitch section of the show is to talk about what you guys participate in that runs a little bit parallel to your experiences in gaming. And I want to pull it back to the education program you guys run with the Royal Ontario Museum. Mm-hmm. Can you give us some good examples of types of games you've run in the past and how that syncs up with the museum's educational programs?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Ross rifles might actually be the best one.
Yeah,
I think so. So for the longest time, the D&D program at the ROM has been going on since the 1990s. It was created by a former employee of the museum named Julian Kingston, who's like an awesome dude. And he started this program, and it was kind of like this D&D club at the ROM. I was actually a participant in that program. It's where I actually got my introduction to tabletop games, and it was taught by an artist named Anthony Harrison. He's super cool, super talented, and I learned like AD&D and 3rd edition D&D. So that's what I kind of grew up playing, mostly 3rd and 3.5. Mm-hmm. I got my degree in 2011, and I took over the course. And I kind of decided that, first of all, I'm getting paid to play D&D, I'm getting paid to teach this. How am I going to make this different?
Amazing.
And I turned it into a creative writing course. And we started working on this kind of shared world that all of our fantasy RPGs, regardless of the system, actually take place in. Because it's a setting for all of our stories, not necessarily our dice rolls. Everything in our sort of fantasy setting at work is informed by the natural and cultural world. So everything in natural history and everything in cultural history that's contained within the museum has inspired the world that we play in. We've, like, a couple of years ago, we expanded into playing other games. And
that was a really powerful change, I think. That was
huge change.
Yeah, it changed the system, or the class.
Like, dramatically.
Yeah.
And we since started playing games like The Warren, which was like a really excellent way to teach natural history to the kids. Obviously, Night Witches.
Yep.
Talk about World War II.
That was a big one.
Right now, I think it's actually closed now, but we have the evidence room at the ROM.
Yeah.
And it
moved to Ottawa, I think.
It moved to Ottawa.
Yeah.
So we had an exhibition at the ROM called The Evidence Room, and it was about Auschwitz. And so playing Night Witches and talking about World War II and kind of contextualizing it in a game from obviously a different perspective was a really cool way to tie it to the lessons and the lectures that we give inside the museum. So we've been tying those games, but I think most dramatically was when we first introduced Ross rifles.
Yeah. That was a good day. So it was actually the day we first played Ross rifles at the museum. In public, I guess. Yeah. Was November 11th of this year, 2017. Last year, I guess.
Of last
2017.
Year.
And it was honestly one of the most powerful days that I've ever had at the Royal Ontario Museum. And I've been there for 15 years.
Yeah, I've been working at the ROM since 2005.
So to back up for a second, because we do have listeners who are in the U.S.
So the Royal Ontario Museum is the largest cultural and natural history museum in Canada.
I was also going to point out that November 11th is Remembrance Day in Canada, and it is a very big deal.
It's a huge deal.
The day the armistice was signed and effectively ended the war.
Yeah, it's a big deal. So on Remembrance Day, on November 11th, I realized that we had a class on November 11th. It was a Saturday class, and I was like, oh my God, we got to get Ross Rifles done. Well, we got to get a draft of Ross Rifles finished. And
Enough to play,
and we had been working on it, and we basically hunkered down in the loft. We ate pizza and burritos, and we wrote Ross Rifles. On the day of Remembrance Day, we actually went on a little field trip. So we went from the ROM, and we went to the University of Toronto St. George campus, which is very close.
Yeah.
For your listeners who aren't from Toronto.
It's like next door.
It's like next door. And they actually have a memorial to the World Wars.
Yeah, so at there's a building on campus called Hart House, and they have a tower there called the Soldiers Tower. And on the inside of the tower is engraved with all of the University of Toronto students who fought in the World Wars, and I think the Korean War as well. And at the top of the tower, there's a little museum that's dedicated to the University of Toronto during the World Wars. And when I first found out that we were having a class on November 11th, I texted Daniel and I was like, we need to do something about this because this is amazing.
Yeah.
I wanted to do this field trip, but I didn't expect that we'd be led up the tower.
Yeah, so we were there, and there were actually a lot of veterans, and they saw that we were a school group there, and they said, do you guys want to go to the top of the tower? And I had never been to the top of the tower.
Yeah, neither had I.
And I've been a student at the University of Toronto since 2007. Wow, I've been there a long time. And that's what happens when you get multiple degrees. And so we went up to the top of the tower, and we saw all of this war paraphernalia. We actually got to see a German MG08 machine gun at the top. The students got to touch it. We got to experience World War I. We did 2 lectures on the property. So I did a lecture, and then Patrick did a lecture. Mm-hmm. And then we went back to the museum, and then we played a World War I RPG. And everybody participated in the same battle. But it was like all 30 students were fighting in the trenches together. And
that sounds like it was an amazing experience.
It was a great day.
It was a great day.
And I didn't expect it. When we got back from the field trip and we asked who wants to play this World War I RPG, I didn't expect many hands to go up, but every single kid in the class was interested in playing it.
Yeah, and we didn't force it on them. They actually wanted to really engage with it. And after that, I think you continued to play Ross Rifles.
Yeah, I played Ross Rifles for the rest of the fall session with my afternoon kids.
Yeah.
They loved it.
So we're really right now entering this renaissance in our program. We're really dramatically linking the game to the lesson that we're having in the gallery.
Well, yeah, it hasn't always been like that, but it is.
Sometimes it's been more about the writing and more about how, sometimes we'll go into the curatorial center and we'll shoot historical bows and arrows. We'll handle weapons. We'll try on armor. And we'll kind of see, how would your character actually move in combat or when they're role-playing? How many swords could you actually carry in D&D? Here, let's see how many you can carry as an 11-year-old. Maybe not even one, right? Or here's a giant Roman shield. Could you carry that and shoot a longbow at the same time?
Definitely not.
Definitely not. And so we have experiential lessons like that. Mm-hmm. Or if, we like to theme our campaign arcs. So if we're doing one that's very sort of East Asian themed, we'll have lessons in Japan, China, Korea.
Yeah, the big thing that I like to take away is if I'm running a fantasy campaign or a sci-fi campaign, anything that's not directly historical, I always try to take one little aspect of the lesson, even if it's just the one, and incorporate it into my gaming for that day.
Yeah.
Because connecting them is what makes the best experience for the kids.
Yeah, so it's a deeply educational gaming experience, even if the game, Dungeon World or D&D or Pathfinder, isn't directly linked to what we were talking about for, say, World War II.
Yeah.
Today, actually, we talked about
Roman funerals.
We talked about Roman funerary practices in the morning. That was my lecture in the morning. And then in the afternoon, we talked about Norse magic. Mm-hmm.
Oh, because there's the Viking exhibit that's currently in at the ROM.
Yes, yeah. We could talk for hours about education and gaming.
So I think, though, this is a great opportunity to segue into the next segment of the show.
Open your brain.
We're going to talk about the game you're writing, which is Ross Rifles. Could you describe a little bit about the setting? We know it's about World War One from the Canadian perspective, but let's dig into that a little bit more.
So, yeah, the setting of the game is the Western Front of the First World War, and you're inhabiting the lives of Canadian soldiers. And one of the big things that I wanted to draw on when we were writing this game is the Canadian experience. It's one thing to write a game about the Western Front, but the experience of being a soldier from Canada, fighting off in a country that you've probably never been to before, that you've never probably even gone outside of your town at this point if you're a farmer in small town Ontario. And you're basically sent to fight this war for a country that your country, Canada, but also Canada didn't have an option to say no to join the war. It was a dominion. Yeah, it was a dominion of Great Britain. You're fighting this war that you really have no involvement in. And I wanted to get at what kind of stories that reveals or brings to the surface. What drives a Canadian soldier to fight on the Western Front in Europe when they don't really care about France?
Well, you also have a familial connection to it.
Yes, my great-grandfather, Thomas Vivian Keenan, went to France in the First World War. He didn't see combat, but he did go.
He enlisted.
Yeah. It's something that it's why would you go, right? That's what I wanted to answer.
Yeah, and for me, I mean, we see a lot of World War II in popular culture and popular media. But when you do see World War I, when you go to high school and you learn about World War I in grade 10, or you watch movies like The Trench or like Passchendaele or the upcoming movie Journey's End. You see white people. Now, I'm a Chinese Canadian, and I really wanted to know, like, is there a game, or is there media out there about World War I that would tell stories that weren't just about white people fighting for Canada? Because I knew that there were more voices and more stories that could have been told. And so on my podcast, Curiosity and Focus, I actually did an episode where I interviewed a retired engineer named Jack Jin. And Jack had been working with the Chinese Canadian Military Museum Society, and they had recently uncovered a long-forgotten soldier who fought at Vimy Ridge and the Battle of Hill 70, and his name was Frederick Lee. Now, he was born and raised in Kamloops, and his name is actually on a memorial there of all the soldiers from all the the men from Kamloops who fought and died in the war. But everybody thought that he was British because his last name was Lee. And so, Jack did some research, and he actually found out that Frederick Lee was Chinese. And at the moment, he is the only known Canadian-born Chinese soldier to fight and die for Canada in World War I. And so I dug deeper, and there were a lot of other stories about, Chinese Canadians, Japanese Canadians, Black Canadians who fought for Canada, but their stories aren't being represented in pop culture. So we wanted to create this game that told a more holistic and inclusive picture of what actually happened during the First World War.
So going into the setting, what do you think is the biggest difference between, and a lot of times in pop culture, we see the American World War I experience or the idealization of the American World War I experience. Well, how do you feel, other than Canada being brought into the conflict via its relations with Britain, the Canadian experience is different from the American experience?
The Canadian experience is actually vastly different from the American experience because Canada fought in the war for a number of years longer.
Yeah, the entirety of the war, Canada was involved in the conflict, versus the Americans were only there from 1917 onwards.
Yeah.
And I think that is a big, big difference, especially when you're looking at, if you're playing a game that's set in the later years of the war and you've been at the Western Front for basically since 1914, the psychological effects, the physical effects that would have on you. Reading stories is harrowing. Mm-hmm. It's incredibly, incredibly scary.
And even your reasons for fighting.
Yeah, that's also a big one.
Yeah, so I think it's really different. I think a lot of people also sometimes get World War I and World War II mixed up. When they think of, the world wars in pop culture, they think of, shows like The Pacific, Band of Brothers, or movies like Saving Private Ryan. Mm-hmm. But those are all the Second World War. And they were fought using vastly different technology and different tactics than the First World War. And so our game, setting-wise, is obviously takes place, over a decade earlier. In trenches.
Mm-hmm. That's the trench warfare is the big part, because there's this almost dualistic nature to it where you'll be waiting for hours and hours and hours, and then you'll be dead within seconds. The boredom is only, like, the combat's only one part of the experience of the Western Front. The boredom and the sitting around and the almost waiting to die, part is also part of it.
How are the mechanics of Ross rifles different from Apocalypse World or other Powered by the Apocalypse games on the market right now?
So there are a number of elements of Ross rifles that make it, markedly different from other games. So there are a lot of Apocalypse games that have phases. So like our favorite one is Night Witches, and it has that day and nighttime phase. In Ross rifles, we have a 3-phase system that's very fluid. So we have, in the trenches, which is when you and your section mates are actually sitting in the trenches, trying to boost morale, trying to perform first aid on each other.
Just the daily life.
Just the daily life. Even trying to get an extra ration to eat. Then there's the patrol phase, which is basically when you're trying to gather intelligence for your superiors. Maybe you're trying to rescue your comrades who have been trapped out in no man's land. And then there's over the top, which is the head-to-head combat. Kind of like, have you seen Wonder Woman?
Everybody's seen Wonder Woman, I think, at this point.
Right? When she climbs up that ladder and her coat comes off and she's in her full costume and she steps into no man's land and the sniper shoots at her and she knocks away all the bullets and everybody's like, she's done it, and they come over the top of the trenches and they charge at the Germans. That's the over-the-top phase. That's combat in our game. But, in the trenches, patrol and over-the-top are fluid. You can go from one to the other, basically at will, based on the direction you want to take the narrative. We've also tried to make a game that has a really good balance between both, the narrative aspect of role-playing that, Powered by the Apocalypse games are really popular for, and tactical combat that people who play D&D or Coriolis or Pathfinder are really used to. So we're trying to, create a game that bridges between, the D20 games and the 2D6 games. And how else would you say it's different? We have things
Vigilance is a big one. So Vigilance is a currency system, and that's not necessarily unique to our game. Lots of Powered by the Apocalypse games have those. But it's a currency system that represents your awareness on the battlefield, your preparedness, how mentally intact you are. And you can use Vigilance to perform special moves.
Yeah.
You don't have to roll to do these moves, and they're often game-changing.
Yeah.
They can change the narrative in a snap.
Yeah, so you can use Vigilance to fall back. You can use Vigilance to do, heroic acts, throw grenades, things like that.
Perform medical aid.
And then, of course, in character creation, we tried to avoid, doing things that were personality-based, and we did things based on rank. So right now, the base game that by the time your listeners are hearing this episode, the preview edition will have been out for about a month. The playbooks we have are all based on rank. So we have Private, Corporal, and Sergeant. Each one, of course, like many Powered by the Apocalypse games, has their own playbook-specific moves. Mm-hmm. But when you're creating your character, you get to pick something called a specialist talent. And it's kind of something that is a carryover from your time in Canada, from when you were not a soldier. So it could be, you were a hunter, and it helps you, instantly kill.
Yeah, take a shot on the battlefield because you have experience in hunting and using guns.
Yeah, or you were...
maybe you're really patriotic.
Yeah.
Then you can inspire your comrades by talking about the king.
Yeah. And then we've also kind of changed combat. Combat in Ross Rifles is very objective-oriented. So in our final version of our book, we're going to have all of the major battles that Canada participated in, and hopefully some more. Mm-hmm. Combat in this is based on this concept of ground. The Western Front was basically like one giant trench, and it was this huge stalemate. And people were fighting over inches of land.
Yeah, land swaps hands pretty much all the time. Yeah. No real gains are ever made.
And so what we've done is for each battle, we've looked up a really interesting anecdotes about what's happened. So we know of a German officer officers who have gone to the front to visit their friends. So we have an objective try to capture the German officer to get intelligence, or there is a signaler and his dog have been stuck out in no man's land. You have to rescue them. But in order to complete these objectives, you have to perform moves that will earn you a currency called ground. And ground basically represents your momentum moving forward. Your momentum leading from your Allied trenches towards the German trenches. I think that's kind of the things that make our game really unique.
Yeah.
That and the book, of course, is a huge history book.
Yeah.
Do you see that this record of the different battles the Canadians were involved with that growing into a campaign structure like you see with Night Witches and the Outpost?
Yeah, so with our game, we actually have a chapter on running the game through skirmishes or by a campaign style. And you can actually play from like the Second Battle of Ypres all the way to like Vimy.
Yeah, that's one of the good things about the game is that you can play this long campaign with your characters that you've made at the beginning, and they arrive in France in 1915, and you're going to play it all the way to the end of the war. Or you can play a one-shot and just make a character and play through one specific objective on one specific battle.
And it still feels like a self-contained game. Mm-hmm. And we've gone through a lot of work to actually make sure each battle has a lot of information for the GM or the MC to actually use. So we have like environmental conditions, threats,
specific temperatures.
Yeah. what the entire Canadian Expeditionary Force was doing in context to what you as a small section or battalion or squad is going to be doing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what would you say are your favorite moves in the game? If you were to narrow it down to one or two.
Oh God. Based on our playtesting, so we've done about we've play tested this game with close to 100 people.
Yeah, I'd say so through the campers and then also
at our public play tests.
Public play tests.
I think my favorite move is actually a playbook specific move. One of the corporal moves is called Stormtrooper. And I think Stormtrooper is a really awesome name because it's so very Canadian in the context of World War I, because the Canadian soldiers were known for their grit and determination, and they were called Stormtroopers. The Stormtrooper move actually allows you to help your allies. So we've put a lot of moves in here that let you help buddies, help your comrades. Yeah. Stormtrooper allows you to basically, if your ally fails at trying to sneak into an enemy trench to neutralize an enemy, you can jump in and save their back.
Yeah, and I think my favorite move is actually, I wouldn't say it's on the complete opposite spectrum, but it's definitely not combat-oriented. It's through thick and thin, which is one of the moves for in the trenches. And that's basically when you want to connect with anyone else in your section, when you want to make some trench art, when you're trying to blow some steam off in the middle of the trench during the downtime, you roll through thick and thin, and it's when you share a moment with someone else in the squad.
Yeah, and you can use it to basically remove fatigue.
Yeah, like the mechanical parts are removing fatigue, and maybe you gain some vigilance, but what's really important is it fosters the role playing, and it brings the two characters together.
What I really like is that we just picked moves that each of us wrote. You wrote Stormtrooper and I wrote Through Thick and Thin.
Yeah.
I love, though, that you addressed trench art, because that was something from my Canadian history classes I was always fascinated by.
Oh, it's so beautiful.
Yeah. And actually the cover that we have is based on a painting by a Canadian soldier. It's called, one second.
It's on the last page.
The last page.
Yeah, so it's this one. It's called
Canadian Century by Lieutenant Alfred Theodore Joseph Bastian.
Yeah. It's trench art, and the way soldiers expressed themselves was really important to us. So we wanted to make sure that we struck a really good balance between, the gruesome reality of the First World War, the hard reality of the combat, but with
what came out of that.
Yeah, but with the camaraderie, the brotherhood, and of course the ways in which soldiers found that they could express themselves while on the battlefield.
Where they found their humanity in a place where humanity was hard to come by.
Yeah, exactly. I should go in the book.
It is time to act under fire.
So our final segment of the show is Act Under Fire. And Patrick is going to run us a short scenario of Ross rifles, correct?
So we'll be doing the Battle of Passchendaele, which is the one that will be in the preview edition, as known from the famous film Passchendaele.
It's not a very good film.
Yeah. So, Rach, do you have a character or any sort of idea of what you might want your soldier to be like?
So if you were fighting in World War I, where do you think in Canada you'd come from? And what do you think your background would be? Were you...
Maybe you were a farmer, or maybe you're from the city?
Yeah.
I'm going to steal a page from my family's history and say that I was born and raised in Montreal. My family has been in Quebec for a couple of generations, and I went over to, or I wanted to become involved in the war because I felt personally it was the right thing to do.
All right, so you were a volunteer.
So you definitely weren't a conscript, and you actually grew up not too far from where people were being trained. People were being trained primarily in Quebec.
Yeah, Valcartier. Did you have a former trade or call-in before you started fighting in the war? Or are you fresh out of school, ready to go?
I'm going to go with fresh out of school.
Okay, so fresh-faced and ready to fight?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not a lot of real-world harsh experience.
Yeah, so you're on. So maybe you're joining the Canadian Expeditionary Force right when Canada joins the war. You don't know anything about the realities of the Western Front, and you think wars are going to be fought much like they did in the 19th century.
It's going to be an adventure, and you're going to be home by Christmas, maybe.
And you're going to be home.
Well, that's what they told me in history class, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so
when making your character, you get to make a number of choices, and we leave a lot of agency up to the players. The first thing you have to do is, obviously, you have to answer a whole bunch of questions that we've actually taken from the attestation papers that people would, sign. So, like, who are you? We would ask, what's your former trade of calling? Where are you from? Are you a volunteer or conscript? Depending on when your game is taking place. Then we'd ask, who are you fighting for? So who are you fighting for?
I think that my character is fighting for themselves because it's all about, like, I'm going out because it's the right thing to do, but it's not really for the country or for the crown. It's because really deep down I'm doing it because this is something I feel like I should do.
So your own sense of morals are kind of pushing you to fight
morals
for your
ethics.
country. Okay, so then in our game we have 4 attributes.
Yeah.
We have valor, eye, wit, and brawn. So valor is kind of your leadership. Eye is your observational skill and your skill with firearms. Wit is, of course, kind of like a measure of your intelligence, but also quick thinking. And brawn is your physical strength. So since you're fresh out of school, which one do you think would be your primary attribute?
Wit.
Okay, so you're very smart. You're well studied. Now, what's interesting in this game is we actually ask the players to pick a gun. Now, firearms in this game don't actually have a mechanical effect on how you play. There's no set amount of damage that a particular gun does, because if you got shot in World War I...
That was it.
That was it. Now, you don't die instantly in this game. Like many Apocalypse games, It's got
the harm box
system. It's got the harm boxes. But what I like about Apocalypse games is that they really embody my DMing style. And my DMing style is like, you have to be the biggest fans of the players. You want to try to make them look good. You want to try to make them, heroic. And so in this game, you do that. But we ask you to pick between a Ross Rifle Mark III and a Lee Enfield Mark III. Now, those are 2 service rifles that were used by the Canadian military. The Ross Rifle before the Lee Enfield. Obviously, the Ross Rifle is like the namesake of our game and has a really unique history.
Yeah, it's identified with Canadian soldiers in the First World War, mostly because it was incredibly ineffective on the battlefield and jammed all the time. And
oh no!
Yeah, it represented the Canadian ingenuity to get over that hurdle.
Yeah, exactly. So even though Canadians had what was objectively the worst service rifle at the beginning of the war, they persevered and earned like a fearsome reputation for themselves. Mm-hmm. So that's why we obviously pick Ross rifles. But also there's a really interesting history behind Canada's decision to manufacture and use the Ross rifle that goes back to the Second Boer War. Back in Africa, and their relationship with Canada's relationship with Britain. So we asked the player to pick a rifle, the Ross rifle or the Lee Enfield, depending on where they are in the game. So what would you pick? Would you pick the rifle that had a bad reputation? At least you wouldn't know it yet because you're going straight into the war.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we totally have to go with the Ross rifle. I mean, it's the game's namesake,
Yeah,
right?
you have to go with the Ross rifle. Since you're young, you're probably like 17 or 18. Chances are you'll be a private.
Mm-hmm. And so if you're a private, you get an option of you get to pick one of a couple of special private moves. We have Fresh Faced, which is a move that represents that you're fresh from the boats and you're new to the Western Front, and you almost like a morale booster. The seasoned veterans at the front see you and they're like, oh man, that's what we were like.
That's what we're fighting for.
That's what we're fighting for, those young boys home at Canada. Unwavering Courage represents that you have bravery no matter what happens, no matter the odds, no matter how many of your comrades die, you will be brave in the face of adversity. And the last one is Got Your Back.
That's my favorite one of the private moves.
Yeah, and Got Your Back is based on forming a bond with another player, and they become your buddy, and you can choose to help them out if they screw up or save them if they're in danger.
Yeah, so Ross Rifles has a heavy emphasis on reactionary teamwork. Mm-hmm. So if you're a private, one of your main jobs is to watch your friends back. You're new to the war, your character is young, chances are you're probably going to pick Got Your Back or Fresh-Faced, and you're going to want to support your friends because they're a source of positivity and morale for you. So what do you think you'd pick? Fresh-Faced, Courage, or Got Your Back?
Got Your Back just sounds so compelling.
It's so cool. It's so cool. So usually, the ideal game has 4 to 5 people, mm-hmm. and usually we only have one sergeant, one corporal, and several privates.
A couple of privates.
To form a really good dynamic. Now, one playbook isn't necessarily better than the other. They just have different play styles. And of course, their rank kind of informs how you might play. Privates, much like in All Quiet on the Western Front, kind of got into some shenanigans. Mm-hmm. And when they were in the reserves, they would kind of leave, go swimming in a lake, go meet up with some girls. Get into trouble. Maybe go steal from a barn.
Yeah, well, you're young and you're the lowest on the totem pole, so you have no one to represent yourself to.
Yeah.
No one's looking up to you, so...
Exactly. So once you make your character, and those are the key things, then you would write down a couple of mementos, keepsakes that you have on your person that you would hold on to, like a photo of your family, mm-hmm. A locket,
maybe a letter from home,
a picture of a loved one, or even a lucky pocket knife. And these are all things that can come into play. We actually designed the game to give players as much freedom as possible to use what's on their playbook. So when it comes to gear and equipment, the players are actually free to do whatever they want with those, mm-hmm. Which is what I'm really excited about. So obviously, we're going to go through, I guess, the Second Battle of Ypres because we started right away. Now, in this battle, we would give you an objective, and now there's a way to randomly generate an objective in this game, but your objective in this case would be to recover a dog. Now, your battalion has a mascot, and it's a tiny little puppy that you rescued from
a French farmhouse.
And it's been a huge source of morale for your section, your squad. Even though you knew German artillery might strike you at dawn or dusk whenever you were eating your meals, that puppy was a source of morale for you.
Yeah, this was actually a really common phenomenon on the Western Front. There was this Nova Scotian battalion who had a mascot that was a goat.
There was a goat.
A kilt. There was a lot of stuff like this.
So this dog has accidentally climbed over the top of the trenches and it has become trapped in a crater in no man's land. And your objective as a section will be to sneak out under the cover of darkness, clip through the barbed wire, and retrieve the puppy. So some of the sort of the gameplay in Ross Rifles actually can be lighthearted, can be little adventures like saving the puppy, or they can be serious things like locating a very deadly German sniper.
Counterattacking through a gas attack.
Yeah. So if you were to go out into no man's land, you were given a pair of barbed wire cutters.
Yep.
What would you do under the cover of darkness if your superior officer, somebody who was like maybe decades older than you, said, "Go get that puppy"? What would you do?
So their superiors are in on this.
Oh, they're in on this because that puppy, despite how tough they are, is very, very important to them.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're definitely going to take a moment in the darkness to scout and see if there's anything on the horizon or any noises other than puppy sounds.
So you'd be using the move called Scan the Horizon.
And so that move would allow you to gain important intelligence. So you would learn about obstacles in no man's land. You might see the glint of a sniper's scope.
You might see maybe a German patrol has the same kind of idea that you do, and they're coming out over the night.
They can hear the yelping of your puppy or the whining of your puppy, thinking maybe they can take the puppy for themselves. So you would scan the horizon looking for patrols. You would look for patrols. You would look for other threats. Okay. Now, we actually have a system in this game called threat points. Mm-hmm. There are no GM moves or MC moves in Ross Rifles. Instead, we've actually given the person who's running the game the freedom to actually introduce threats and actually organically do that. Now, we do have a currency called threat points, which basically are a scaled basically...
it's a scaled way to add...
you could say tensions
fear. And obstacles for the players into the game. I almost think of it as like the GM's response to the player's vigilance. Like, if vigilance represents the players being more aware of their situation, threat points represents the Germans being aware of where the players are.
Yeah. So you scan the horizon, you see that there is you can see the glint of a German sniper's scope, maybe 100 meters away from you. Okay? What would you do now?
I think I'm going to take a moment to sort of, again, re-gauge my surroundings and see if there's enough cover for me to kind of piece together. Now, I guess the question is the scope trained on me? Or did I see it first?
I don't know if the scope's trained on you. This is the first time you've ever encountered a German sniper, but you have heard that there are some very talented ones out there.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I might do is I'm going to look see if I can find 2 potential points of cover and see if there's a rock or a stone and throw it to the section of cover that's not where I'm intending to go, the one that's further away from the puppy, and see if that gets a reaction.
So you throw the rock into no man's land. You hear it clank against what could be like a helmet of a soldier or a piece of shrapnel or metal that's out there.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that the way the moonlight is reflecting off the scope completely changes, and the German sniper has aimed in the direction that you've thrown your rock.
And this is the opportunity I need to skedaddle to get under that other piece of cover slightly closer to the dog.
Yeah, so you sneak your way through. You would use the sabotage move to try to, stealthily...
Cut through some barbed wire, or maybe there's a bulwark of dirt that you need to get over, something like that. Maybe there's a landmine.
Yeah.
Anything that represents the German defense that you need to sabotage.
Now, crawling across no man's land, you would crawl from crater to crater, kind of like you're undulating through the land.
Mm-hmm.
Going from crater to crater until you finally make it to the puppy. Now, in a normal game of Ross Rifles, you'd have a group of your friends with you.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a whole bunch of privates and a daring corporal.
Which would complicate things.
Which would very much complicate things. Because, everybody kind of wants to be involved. But in this case, you've gone in on your own. And, to speed things up, you would get the puppy, and maybe things might go wrong. The puppy might bark. The puppy might be really excited to see you and give away your position. Now, in this case, it would be up to your allies. Maybe somebody's got your back.
Got your back.
And they help you actually return back to the trenches. And that could literally be a 1-hour session of Ross Rifles that can lead into a larger battle.
Mm-hmm. Or, if all goes wrong and you're spotted by the enemy, you could enter into combat, into the over-the-top phase. It's very fluid between the phases.
Yeah, so you've gone from in the trenches to patrol and then back into the trenches, or you can go in the trenches, patrol, and then over the top.
Yeah.
And your allies can storm over the top to help you rescue this puppy, and there can be this really dramatic gunfight over a cute dog.
I think that was a fantastic taste of the game, and just the amount of scope tonally where you can go exploring, again, World War I with the system.
Yeah, and I think the true power of the game doesn't come from the combat or the role-playing or anything beyond its self-contained stories. As in, you don't ever feel like you're actually contributing to the overall narrative of the war, but you have this...
You're still developing.
You're developing something with your comrades, and it's small, and it's localized, but it's beautiful.
But that's the experience that most soldiers had in the First World War, and that's the point of Ross Rifles.
It's a very slice-of-life examination of what the war was like.
Very slice of life. If I could put it in like a manga genre, it would be slice of life, like Yatsuba.
Yeah.
4 panels?
Yeah.
And I think the reason why I wanted to do a game like that was because when you read about World War I and you learn about it in school, you sort of get this political narrative and you get an overarching historical narrative, but you never really get the personal stories. And that's the big thing about remembering the war. It's not just what happened, it's what people experienced. And it's almost like playing Ross Rifles is an act of remembrance for me.
Definitely.
Something where it's like you put yourself into the war and you almost understand what it was like. in a sense.
Yeah, and we hope that, when people play Ross Rifles, they want to go and find new stories about, World War One. Maybe stories that would influence their characters, or maybe they'll learn something new about their family. Maybe they'll feel compelled to say, did anybody from my family participate in the First World War?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a great note to go out on. So, Patrick and Daniel, where can people find you online if they're interested more in what you're doing, both online and in the educational realm in Toronto, or find out more about Ross Rifles?
So if you want to learn more about Ross Rifles, you can follow us on social media. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Dundas West Games. Mm-hmm. You can head to facebook.com/Dundas West Games. For my personal educational work, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat at Daniel H. Kwan, Kwan. And you can go to my website where I write about the educational use of tabletop games at danielhkwan.com.
And yeah, you can get to me, you can email me at patrick@dundaswestgames.com, or you can find me on Twitter and Instagram as Keenan_Patrick.
And thank you for everyone for tuning in and listening to this episode.
Plus One Forward is a production of the Gauntlet community, Richard Rogers and Rach Shelkey. You can find us at gauntlet-rpg.com or follow us on Twitter at +1FWD. If you would like to support our show, visit our Patreon site at patreon.com/gauntlet. The games mentioned on this show use the Apocalypse engine, which is a creation of Vincent and Magay Baker. The music for Plus One Forward is from the Savage Aural Hotbed CD Gomi Daiko. The songs used are Gomi Daiko, Metal Version, and Drowning Attitude. You can find more amazing tunes by Savage Aural Hotbed on their website, www.savageauralhotbed.com.